one of the areas that I've worked and have a bunch of discoveries happens to be vision. So I have other things in other areas of sort of evolutionary biology, why we have as many fingers and why animals have as many limbs as they do, why you get pruny fingers when you're wet. They're actually optimized to be rain treads so that when you don't want a hydroplane, so they suddenly have the optimal pattern so that you can channel the water out as quickly as possible. So these are all the sorts of things that I was always dealing with.
We're very sneaky, us people.
That's right. So always I was interested not in the specific mechanisms by which our brains work, but on the ultimate sort of design questions for why it would have evolved that way.
So functional.
Yeah, it's all about function. And strangely, I mean, this is more on the political side. Strangely, even though the biological world claims to believe in Darwin, when you're actually there in the evolutionary biology world, almost nobody believes in natural selection. They nod to it, but if you actually do a paper that argues, here's why it evolved to be this way, here's the functional reason for why it's this way, they'll say, you're doing a just so story. You're not allowed to make hypotheses about design. That's a just so story. That's teleology. I was like, you're missing the entire point of natural selection. Darwin's discovery is that, yes, there's design. That's not an issue.
Well, sexual selection also amplifies that.
Well, I mean, sexual selection has things that are not leading to perfect natural selection design, but let's set that aside for the moment. The whole point is not that there's not design. The whole point is that there need not be a master designer. That is, you can explain all this design, all the seeming teleology without a designer. That's the whole point, right? But what they want to reject is not just a designer, but they want to reject design itself. And so there's an immense...
Reject teleology itself.
Reject teleology. No, like my eyes.
Yeah, that's weird.
All of this, it's bizarre. So, right? And so it's a very small community, and it becomes across as, they attack sociobiology, EOE, on the same kind of basis.
Yeah.
You start it happens not just when you enter into human behavior and human psychology. It happens even generally when you're talking about even rain treads, pruning fingers like I did, or any of the stuff that I do. That is a just so story, and it is not allowed, right? Now, it's true that you can't study design the way that you study mechanisms. You can't do a lab experiment in quite the same way. You have to ask it in different kinds of ways. You have to say, if this is really designed for what I'm claiming it's designed for, let's say, if the pruny fingers are designed to be rain treads, well, then let's derive what the optimal morphology would be. What should the wrinkles actually look like? So that's one kind of prediction, looking at the morphology or the shape. Another might be, if it's really the case that it's for design, well, it should only occur in animals that have wet, dewy conditions, whereas certain kinds of animals that are never in wet, dewy conditions shouldn't have this, this morphological feature shouldn't appear. There's different kinds of predictions you can make, but they're often phylogenetic predictions, morphological predictions. Sometimes you can do behavioral, do they actually perform better in wet conditions when they're wrinkly versus when they're not wrinkly, and all the kind of combinations of these things. What you can't typically do the mechanism kinds of experiments. It's just a whole different kind of thing. So you have to do it differently. But the strange, weird thing in the incredibly far left communities as they are, is that they somehow have thrown Darwin out entirely, and you can't talk about natural selection, which was an incredibly bizarre thing.
So I can think of a variety of possible reasons for that, and I'd like your opinions about those reasons. I mean, you tangled together a couple of things. You said that even as an evolutionary biologist, if you start to tread in the water of teleology or purpose, you receive pushback from your colleagues. And then you mentioned that was also a far left phenomenon. And so I'm curious about, it seems to me that the relationship with the far left is likely the fact that the far left political philosophy is predicated on a radical social constructionism, essentially, that every single thing that everyone does, especially human beings, but to the degree that the same thinking paralyzes speculation about animal evolution, there's an insistence among those on the far left that there's no essential human nature. Right. Everything's infinitely malleable. Right. And I see that as a reflection of an incredible intellectual arrogance, because the reason for the insistence that everything is socially constructed is because that allows for the possibility for everything to be 100% modifiable by those, for example, who would like to modify human behavior and the image of their own philosophy. Do you think is there anything else? Do you think that's going on with regards to the rejection of purpose or so-called design?
I mean, my pet assumption has been that their hair stands on end, or they get they feel backed up against the wall. When you get to human behavior, Steven Pinker and Blank Slate arguing this as well. The idea that there's any notion of instinct or a human nature is against something. They really want to push back on that because they want to think of us as infinitely malleable and subject to socialism and whatever policies that they have. They can shape us however they wish. And so even when we're in things like pruning fingers, it's as if they've taken that kind of prohibition of human psychology and push it into any realm at all, and have a general admonition not to do any kind of design or research that concerns the design of animals themselves. So I'm not sure what else it could be, but at any rate, it's a bizarre thing because the only
there's something else too there. Maybe it's something like there's a lot of reasons for rejecting the idea of purpose. One is to reject the idea of an ultimate designer. So there's a religious argument, say, lurking at the bottom of that. But it's also very convenient to reject the notion of purpose or meaning because it also allows you to reject the idea of any kind of implicit responsibility. Like if nothing has any meaning, the disadvantage to everything being meaningless is that things are meaningless, but the advantage to everything being meaningless and purposeless is that you can do whatever the hell you want. Right. And so it's a very good rationalization for like short-term hedonistic power-mad behavior. And if you combine that with the problem of like infinite social constructionism, then you have a real problem. But it's a weird thing that you would encounter that at least among hypothetically evolutionary biologists and thinkers, because why would they be concerned with evolutionary biology if they are going to toss out Darwin, for example?
Right. And most of them don't really have to think about Darwin because they're doing mechanistic experiments. They're not doing hypotheses about its design. I'm one of the rare people back, in the 1920s, you had the ethologists who did a lot more thinking in terms of the design and the function, really thinking about their evolutionary connection. But that's gone way away. Everybody's dealing with really complicated experiments with mechanisms. They don't have to think about it. So they've somehow developed this knee-jerk reaction that you don't have to understand design and purpose. But you cannot understand any machine without understanding what it's designed for. So if I often use an example, if you were to find a stapler out of the middle of nowhere, natives find a stapler for the first time, and they want to try to understand it. There's not much to a stapler. There's like 4 parts or whatever, 6 parts. But you can't, you might work out all the mechanisms. This opens this, there's like 7 things, let's say, and they do these sorts of kinds of actions. Well, that's not an understanding of it. You might start saying, well, maybe it's a weapon, and you start shaking it around like nunchucks. You open it up. Mm-hmm. Well, now you can work out how does it break when you hit someone in the face? Does it bend? And maybe that's part of it. There's tons and tons of mechanistic behaviors that have nothing to do with what it's in fact for. How it deforms when this happens. There's lots of infinite numbers of kinds of mechanisms that are involved with it that are completely irrelevant, right? Only by understanding the mechanisms in the context of what the function is for. This is where the computational hardware. You've got function, you've got the algorithm level, you've got the mechanistic implementation level. You have to understand all these systems by understanding it by all of these parts all cohering together in one.
In relationship to function.
In relationship to function at the top. And so they're throwing out the very thing that allows you to understand, even if they are only interested in mechanisms, which my eyes glaze over with mechanisms, you can't understand mechanisms without inherently understanding the functions.